The map was a lie. Violet Lockhart stood in the center of Harlan Decker's grand study, her dust-covered coat dripping the last of the evening rain onto his imported Persian rug, and she held the evidence in her steady hands like a loaded weapon. The land surveys spread across the mahogany desk were meticulous forgeries, and she had known it for 11 days. She had traced every false boundary line, decoded every hidden measurement, and followed every fabricated notation back to its poisoned source. Now she stood here, in the home of the most powerful man in Cutter's Bluff, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1883, while a room full of armed men watched her with the particular brand of contempt reserved for people who were supposed to stay invisible. "You have no idea what you are looking at," Harlan Decker said from behind his desk. He was a broad man with silver hair and a voice that had spent 20 years learning how to sound reasonable while doing unreasonable things. "You are a drifter, a nobody. You wandered into my town with a mule and a saddlebag, and now you are standing in my home making accusations." "I'm not making accusations," Violet said, and her voice was quieter than the rain outside, but it carried across the entire room without effort. "I am reading your own handwriting back to you. Survey marker 7 on the Glenwood Creek tract has been moved 42 feet to the southwest. Survey marker 14 on the Ridgeline Holdings has been altered to absorb 600 acres of federally protected grazing land. And the notary seal on the Callaway deed transfer is a forgery because the real notary, a man named Edmund Price, died in Santa Fe 3 months before the date stamped on that document." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Harlan Decker's jaw tightened. His 2 hired guns shifted near the door, and standing in the far corner of the room, arms crossed and expression unreadable, was Wesley Carson, the man who had brought her here, the man who had spent the last 2 weeks dismissing her as harmless, calling her quiet and strange and best left alone, and who was now looking at her like the earth had tilted slightly beneath his boots. She had not expected to feel anything about that look. She had not planned to feel anything at all. She had been wrong about that, but that was not where the story began. It began 11 days earlier, on the edge of town, with a stolen map and a woman nobody bothered to look at twice. Violet Lockhart arrived in Cutter's Bluff on a Tuesday in early October with $63 sewn into the lining of her coat, a surveyor's transit strapped to her pack mule, and no intention of staying longer than it took to resupply and move on. She was 27 years old, lean and weathered in the way that people who live outdoors become. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a plain hat and eyes the color of winter sage. She was not pretty in a way that anyone noticed immediately, and she had learned to be grateful for that. Pretty women in frontier towns drew attention. Attention was dangerous. She had been drifting for 2 years, since the survey office in Albuquerque had dissolved after the director ran off with the operating fund, and the territory's contract had expired. Before that she had spent 4 years as a licensed land surveyor, one of only 3 women in the New Mexico Territory to hold that certification, a fact that had required her to study twice as hard, argue 3 times as forcefully, and accept half the pay of her male counterparts before she finally held that paper in her hands. She knew land. She knew measurement. She could read a terrain with the same fluency that other people read books, and she could detect a falsified survey line the way a trained nose detects smoke before anyone sees the flame. She had not planned to use that skill in Cutter's Bluff. She had planned to buy flour, beans, and horseshoe nails and leave. The map changed that. She found it on the ground outside the assay office, half trampled in the mud, and she only picked it up because a piece of paper on the ground is always worth a glance when you have spent your professional life understanding that documents have power. She shook the mud off, unfolded it, and stood there in the October morning while her mule, a patient animal she called Compass, waited beside her. It was a survey map of the Glenwood Creek Valley. She knew that valley. She had passed through it on the way into town and had automatically noted its features the way she always did, because her brain did not know how to look at land without cataloging it. And what she had seen in the valley and what the map described were two different things. She stood there in the muddy street and looked at the map for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into her coat, and walked into the land office. The land office in Cutter's Bluff was a narrow room with peeling wallpaper and a clerk behind a counter who had the look of a man who had given up on ambition sometime in his early 30s and found the arrangement quite comfortable. He looked up when Violet came in, took a rapid inventory of her dusty clothes and unremarkable appearance, and looked back down. "Help you," he said, without interest. "I would like to review the recent deed transfers and survey records for the Glenwood Creek Valley," Violet said, "and the Ridgeline holdings east of town, and anything filed under the Callaway name in the last 18 months. The clerk looked up again with a different kind of attention, the kind that was already deciding she did not belong here. "Those are public records, but they require a processing fee and a legitimate reason for the request." "My reason is legitimate," Violet said pleasantly. "I am a licensed land surveyor with a professional interest in accurate boundary documentation. Here is my certification." She placed her surveyor's license on the counter. The territory seal was genuine, the signature was her own, and the clerk stared at it with the expression of a man whose morning had gone in an unexpected direction. He charged her the fee. He gave her the records. He watched her sit down at the narrow table in the corner with the stack of documents and pull a small leather notebook from her coat pocket, and then he forgot about her entirely. That was what people always did. They looked at Violet Lockhart, catalogued her as unremarkable, and moved on. It was the most useful quality she had ever developed. She spent 3 hours with the records that first morning. By the end of the first hour, she knew something was wrong. By the end of the second, she knew it was deliberate. By the end of the third, she had filled 6 pages of her notebook with measurements, reference numbers, and questions, and she understood that she was looking at a land fraud scheme of extraordinary scope and sophistication. Harlan Decker, the largest landowner in the territory between Santa Fe and the Arizona border, had been systematically falsifying survey records to absorb neighboring properties. The method was elegant in a way that only worked because nobody was looking for it. He would arrange for a legitimate survey to be conducted, then alter the records afterward with forged notations and false marker positions, moving boundary lines by amounts small enough to seem like ordinary measurement discrepancies. 40 feet here, 60 feet there. Nothing that would make a smaller landowner immediately suspicious. But when you added it up across 23 different properties over 4 years, Decker had stolen thousands of acres of land and was in the process of stealing thousands more, including 600 acres of federally protected grazing land that dozens of small ranching families depended on to keep their herds alive through winter. The Callaway family were among those families. Violet had read their name in 3 separate documents before she left the land office, and all 3 times she had felt the cold, specific anger that comes from understanding exactly how ordinary people get destroyed by systems designed to look legitimate. She walked back to the boarding house where she had paid for a room for 2 nights, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and held the conversation with herself that always preceded the moment she decided to involve herself in something that was absolutely not her business. She was a drifter. She had no stake in this town. She had no allies here, no authority, and no weapon beyond her own knowledge. The sensible thing was to forward her findings to the Territorial Land Office and move on. She thought about that for approximately 4 minutes. Then she unstrapped her surveyor's transit from her pack mule, cleaned it carefully, and began planning how to document the actual positions of the altered survey markers before the winter weather made field work impossible. It was during her second morning of field work in the Glenwood Creek Valley that she encountered Wesley Carson. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a horse at a working canter on the valley trail, and she did not look up from her transit because she was in the middle of taking a bearing, and interruption at the wrong moment costs you the measurement. She heard the horse slow and stop. She heard the silence of a man deciding what to make of what he was seeing. She finished her reading, noted it in her book, and then straightened up. He was sitting on a large bay horse and looking at her with an expression that occupied the space between suspicion and outright confusion. He was tall, even on horseback, with broad shoulders and a rancher's build, the kind of physical presence that comes from years of actual outdoor work rather than the cultivated look of it. His face was weathered in a way that put him somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair and the kind of jaw that had clearly disagreed with a fist at some point and won the argument. He wore a deputy sheriff's badge on his coat, somewhat reluctantly. She would later learn. "That is a surveyor's transit," he said, as if checking to confirm what his eyes were telling him. "It is," Violet agreed. "You are doing a survey." "I am verifying existing survey markers," she said. "Which is a related but technically distinct activity." He stared at her. "Who sent you out here?" "Nobody sent me. I am contracted to the Territorial Land Improvement Commission." This was not precisely a lie, because she was still technically listed as a contractor with the commission, even though the commission had not paid her in 14 months. She did not elaborate on the distinction. "The commission sent a woman," he said, and there was no malice in it, only genuine bafflement, which she supposed was slightly better. "The commission employed a surveyor," she said. "I am that surveyor, Violet Lockhart." She did not offer her hand because her hands were full of equipment. She also did not apologize for her existence, which seemed to be what he was quietly waiting for. He studied her for another moment, then swung down from his horse with the practiced ease of someone who had done that particular motion 10,000 times. "Wesley Carson, deputy sheriff, and you are technically trespassing. This land belongs to Harlan Decker." "According to which survey?" Violet said. He stopped. It was a small thing the way he stopped, but she noticed it the way she noticed everything. His expression shifted from administrative authority to something more careful. "According to the deed on file with the county." "The deed on file with the county is based on a survey completed in April of last year," Violet said, keeping her voice level and informational, because she had learned that information delivered without emotion was harder to dismiss. "I would be interested to know the name of the surveyor who conducted that work, because several of the reference markers do not correspond to the physical features documented in the original 1871 territorial survey." The careful expression deepened. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that boundary lines do not move on their own," Violet said. "I am saying that survey markers do not migrate 42 feet to the southwest between 1871 and 1882 without human assistance, and I am saying that I find that interesting." She turned back to her transit. "You are welcome to stay and watch me work, deputy, if you are concerned about my presence on the property, or you are welcome to leave. Either way, I intend to finish this measurement." He stayed. She had not expected that. She was aware of him as she worked, in the way that a person cannot help being aware of a large, watchful presence standing 20 feet behind them in an otherwise empty valley. He did not speak, which she respected. He did not offer help she had not requested, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated. He simply watched, and when she moved her equipment to the next position, he moved too, leading his horse, keeping the same quiet 20 feet of distance. After the third measurement, she said, without turning around, "The marker should be here." She put her boot on the ground. "The ground has been disturbed here. You can see where the original stone was removed and the replacement set. The soil color is different. Someone packed it back, but the compaction is incomplete. A wet season would show it clearly." There was a long pause behind her. "How long have you known about this?" he asked. 24 hours, she said. Another pause. She heard him exhale, a long, slow breath that contained what she suspected was a complicated set of emotions. "Decker owns most of this county," he said quietly. "He employs half the men in it. He has the ear of the territorial governor." "I am aware of that," she said. Are you aware of what happens to people who accuse Harlan Decker of wrongdoing in Cutter's Bluff? She finally turned around. He was looking at her with something that was not quite fear and not quite warning, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. He was, she realized, genuinely concerned, not condescending, concerned. What happens to them? She asked. They leave, he said, or something worse. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to her transit. I appreciate the warning, Deputy Carson. That is not what that was, he said, and there was something rough at the edges of his voice. What was it? He was quiet for a moment. I do not know yet, he finally said. She wrote down her measurement and moved to the next position. He followed. That became the pattern of the next several days. She would go out before sunrise, set up her equipment in a new location, and at some point in the morning, Wesley Carson would appear on the Valley Trail. He did not pretend after the first day to be there for any official reason. He simply came and watched, and occasionally said something that turned out to be useful. He knew this land in the way that people who have lived somewhere for a long time know it, not in measurements and bearings, but in the texture of it, in the knowledge that the creek ran higher in September, that the old cedar line marked where the first homesteaders had tried to plant windbreaks, that the Callaway family's cattle had ranged this valley since before Harlan Decker had arrived from Kansas City with his money and his ambitions. He came in 1874, Wesley told her on the third day, sitting on a flat rock while she worked, bought the old Remington place and started expanding. At first everybody thought it was good for the county. He built the bank, the assay office, paid good wages. And then, Violet said, and then the Hendersons lost their property in a dispute over a water right. The Mabrys had a fire. The Callaways have been in a boundary dispute for 2 years that is bleeding them dry in legal fees. He paused. I always thought it was just the way things went. Land consolidation, the strong absorbing the weak. It is not the way things go, Violet said flatly. It is the way things are made to go. There is a difference. She straightened from her equipment and looked at him directly. Did you suspect him? He met her gaze with the particular honesty of a man who has been carrying an uncomfortable truth and is relieved to put it down. I suspected something, he said. I did not have the language for it. I did not know what I was looking for. Most people do not, she said, without contempt. Land fraud is designed to be invisible to people who do not read surveys for a living. The measurements look technical. The documents look official. The changes are too small to be obvious and too consistent to be accidental. You need a specific kind of knowledge to see it. The kind you have, he said. The kind I have, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. The morning light was coming across the valley at a low angle and doing something warm to the tops of the grass. Why are you doing this? He asked. You could have sent a report to the territorial office and been gone. Violet was quiet for a long moment. She was thinking about how to answer that, or rather whether to answer it at all, because the true answer involved parts of herself that she did not usually offer to strangers. Because I was 10 years old when my father lost his farm to a boundary dispute, she said, and nobody with the knowledge to see what had happened was willing to be bothered about it. She picked up her transit. I decided a long time ago that I would be that person. The one who is willing to be bothered. She walked to the next measurement position and did not look back at him, but she heard him, after a moment, get up from the rock and follow. The complication arrived in the form of Harlan Decker's foreman, a man named Burl Garrett, on the 4th day. Garrett was the kind of man who had learned that size and a cold expression solved most problems before they became problems, and he arrived in the valley with 2 other men from Decker's payroll and positioned himself in front of Violet's equipment with the specific intention of being impossible to work around. This is private property, Garrett said. You are trespassing. I have a professional authorization from the county clerk, Violet said, which was something she had obtained the previous afternoon by being very persistent and technically accurate about her credentials. She showed it to him. He looked at it without reading it, which told her he could not read well, and handed it back. The authorization does not mean anything. Mr. Decker wants you off his land. Mr. Decker's land ends at the boundary line, Violet said. And since the location of that boundary line is precisely what I am here to document, I will need to complete my work before I can determine whether I am, in fact, on his land. Garrett took a step toward her, and this was where Wesley Carson stepped out from the tree line where he had arrived 5 minutes earlier and had been watching the situation develop. "Morning, Burl," Wesley said. He said nothing else. He simply stood there, all 6 feet and 2 inches of him, with his thumbs in his belt and the complete stillness of someone who has absolutely no concern about the current situation. And Garrett looked at him, and at the 2 men with him who had clearly recalculated the odds and looked back at Violet. "Mr. Decker will hear about this," Garrett said. "I expect so," Wesley said agreeably. Garrett left. His men left with him. The valley returned to its quiet, interrupted only by the October wind moving through the cedar line. Violet looked at Wesley. "Thank you," she said. It was not easy for her to say that to someone, and he seemed to understand it, the slight stiffness of it, the acknowledgement behind the precision. "I did not do anything," he said. "You handled the conversation. I just stood here." "Standing here was the appropriate contribution," she said. Something shifted in his expression, a quiet warmth that he did not broadcast. "What are you going to do when you have finished the field work? How do you prove the records were altered?" "I need to get into the land office after hours and compare the original 1871 survey records with the recent ones side by side," she said. "The original measurements will have been recorded in a different hand and a different ink. The alterations will be visible under close examination if you know what to look for. I also need to verify the notary seal on the Callaway deed transfer. The real Edmund Price died in March. I found his obituary in the Santa Fe Gazette at the newspaper office. The deed was notarized in June. That is a forgery." Wesley stared at her. "You found the obituary." "I went to the newspaper office and read the back issues," she said simply. "It is the kind of thing you do when you are building a case." "You are building a case," he said slowly. "Not just a report, an actual legal case." "I have some experience with the structure of land fraud litigation," she said. "My father's case was litigated for 3 years before it was abandoned for lack of documented evidence. I learned what documented evidence looks like, what it takes to make it hold up." He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, and did not have the experience to recognize immediately, because nobody had ever looked at her quite that way before. It was not the blank look of being overlooked, and it was not the skeptical look of being underestimated. It was the look of someone genuinely revising their understanding of another person and finding the revision surprising and extraordinary. "Miss Lockhart," he said carefully, "how many people have made the mistake of dismissing you?" "Nearly everyone," she said. "I find it useful." He laughed, and it was sudden and real, and it made him look completely different, younger and less burdened, and she felt something happen in her chest that she was entirely unprepared for. She turned back to her work before he could see her face. She gained access to the land office on the evening of the 6th day. Wesley arranged it by using his deputy's authority to request access to county records for an official investigation, which was technically true and deliberately vague about the nature of the investigation. The clerk was suspicious but could not reasonably refuse, and Violet spent 4 hours in the narrow back room with a magnifying glass and a lamp, comparing documents while Wesley stood in the main office and kept the clerk engaged in an extremely slow conversation about fence regulations. What she found exceeded even her own careful expectations. The alterations to the survey records were not just the 42 feet on Glenwood Creek. There were 17 separate instances of falsification across 4 years of records, some so subtle that they would have been essentially impossible to detect without professional training, and the original baseline surveys to compare against. The forged notary seal on the Callaway deed was a professional quality forgery, but the ink formulation was subtly different from authentic notary work of the period, and the pressure patterns of the stamp were slightly irregular in a way consistent with a cast reproduction rather than an original instrument. She documented everything in her notebook, made careful copies in her own hand, and noted every reference number and document date. By the time she emerged from the back room, her notebook was nearly full and her hand was cramping from 2 hours of meticulous writing, and Wesley Carson looked at her with the expression of a man waiting for news from a battle. "It is worse than I thought," she said quietly. They walked out into the night, and she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was another thing she had not expected of him. Men in her experience either dismissed her technical information as beyond their interest or interrupted with questions that revealed they had stopped listening. Wesley walked beside her through the dark streets of Cutter's Bluff and listened to every word, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The Calloway family is going to lose their place by spring if this continues," he said. "They have already sold their winter cattle to cover the legal fees." "I know. And the Henderson land that Decker took 3 years ago, those people left the territory. They are gone." "I know that too." He stopped walking. They were at the edge of town, near the livery where Compass was stabled, and the night was clear and very cold, the stars brilliant and indifferent above them. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face had a gravity to it that she found she was not immune to. "What do you need to finish this?" he asked. "I need to get into Decker's private study," she said. "The original falsified survey records were created there. The forger, whoever it was, would have needed reference materials and tools that leave traces. If I can find the original working documents, the discrepancy between what was created and what was filed becomes demonstrable in court." "That is not trespassing," he said. "That is breaking and entering." "Yes," she agreed. He looked at her steadily. "And you are asking me to help you do that." "I am not asking you to do anything," she said carefully. "I am telling you what I need to do. What you choose to do is entirely your decision, and I would not hold it against you if you chose not to be involved. You have a life here, I do not." There it was, the thing she had been aware of since the first day, the asymmetry of their situations. She was a drifter. She would finish this and leave. She always left. It was the only way she knew how to be. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and the cold between them was doing something it had not been doing before. "I was born in this valley," he said. "My parents are buried on a ridge 3 miles east of here. I have watched Harlan Decker take this county apart piece by piece, and I have told myself I could not prove anything, that there was nothing to be done." He paused. "You have been here 6 days, and you have built the case I told myself could not be built." "I knew what to look for," she said. "That is not all of it," he said quietly. "You were willing to look. That is not nothing, Miss Lockhart." She did not know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to being seen clearly and having what was seen be something other than an inconvenience. "Violet," she said, "you have been following me around this valley for 6 days. You might as well use my name." Something warmed behind his eyes. "Violet," he said, and her name had never sounded like that before in her entire life. "Wesley," she said, trying it, and she watched his jaw shift slightly at the sound of it from her mouth, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the conversation had arrived somewhere unexpected, and both of them were aware of it. "We will do it tomorrow night," he said. "Decker has a monthly dinner at the saloon on Thursdays. He will be out of the house for 3 hours. That should be enough time." "It should be," she said. She should have gone back to her boarding house. She should have reviewed her notes and planned her strategy for the following night. Instead, she stood in the cold for another moment and said, "How did you end up as a deputy sheriff? You do not strike me as someone who pursued it by ambition." He made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "The previous sheriff needed someone he could trust, and I was available. It suits me well enough. I know everyone and everyone knows me, and I am good at standing between trouble and people who cannot afford to handle trouble themselves." "You are good at that," she agreed, thinking of Garrett in the valley. "It is less useful than what you do," he said. She looked at him. What I do is read documents and take measurements. What you do, he said, is see things that are deliberately hidden and refuse to let them stay hidden. That is not just a skill, that is a kind of courage. She did not have a response to that, not one she was willing to give him yet. "Good night, Wesley," she said. "Good night, Violet," he said. She walked back to the boarding house with her notebook pressed against her chest, and her heart behaving in a way that was not strictly professional. The following 2 days she spent preparing. She made clean copies of every document in her notebook, organized her evidence chronologically, and drafted a detailed written summary of her findings that could be submitted directly to the Territorial Land Commissioner without requiring her physical presence. She did this because she was careful, and because she was a woman who understood that sometimes the people who uncover the secret do not get to be the ones who tell it. She also went to the Callaway Ranch. It was a reasonable ride east of town, a modest spread with good grass and a creek running through the south pasture. The house was clean and well kept in the determined way of people who are working very hard to maintain the appearance of stability. Margaret Callaway answered the door and looked at Violet with the exhausted suspicion of someone who has been dealing with too many strangers bearing bad news. "I am a land surveyor," Violet said. "I have been examining the boundary dispute on your eastern parcel, and I have information I think you need to hear." Margaret Callaway was 52 years old, with a rancher's hands and a widow's eyes, her husband having died the previous spring. Her son Thomas, who was 23 and ran the ranch with her, came in from the barn at the sound of voices, and together they sat at the kitchen table while Violet laid out what she had found. She watched their faces move through disbelief, then anger, then the specific terrible relief of people who have known something was wrong and have spent years being told they were imagining it. "We have been paying lawyers to argue over a line that was moved on purpose," Thomas said. "Yes," Violet said. "And you can prove it." "I am building the proof," Violet said. "I need a few more days, but I want you to know that the case exists and it is documented. Even if something happens to me, the documentation will be forwarded to the Territorial Land Commissioner and the Federal Surveyor General's office." She had already addressed and sealed the package. It was sitting at the boarding house with instructions to the landlady to mail it in 3 days if Violet had not collected it herself. That was not pessimism. That was procedure. Margaret Callaway reached across the table and took Violet's hand in both of hers. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Violet rode back to town and found Wesley waiting outside her boarding house with his horse, looking like a man who had been there long enough to be impatient but was too proud to show it. "I went to the Callaways," she said before he could ask. His expression did something complicated. "I figured. They deserve to know the case exists." "I am not arguing with you," he said. "I am just considering the fact that you went out to a ranch alone in the middle of a situation that has real physical danger attached to it without telling anyone." "I tell myself," she said. "That has always been sufficient." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he used when she said something that frustrated him and impressed him simultaneously, as if the two feelings were fighting for space and neither was quite winning. "It is not sufficient," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at him carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means I would like to know where you are going," he said, "so that if something goes wrong, there is someone who knows where to look." It was a practical reason, a logical reason. It was absolutely the kind of reason that could be cited as entirely professional and non-personal. Violet Lockhart was a woman who could read a survey line to the inch and identify a forged document at a glance, and she was completely unable to pretend that was all he meant. "All right," she said quietly. "I will tell you where I am going." He nodded, something easing in his jaw. That night, they talked on the boarding house porch until the cold drove the other residents inside and they were alone. And Violet told him things she had not told anyone in years. About her father's farm, about the 3 years she had spent teaching herself mathematics from borrowed books, about the survey examination she had taken twice because the first examiner had lost her application, and she had been certain it was deliberate. About the 4 years in the survey office in Albuquerque, and the slow, grinding experience of being the most qualified person in the room and the least taken seriously. Wesley listened to all of it with the particular attentiveness of a man who was building a picture and understood that every piece mattered. "You carry a lot of anger," he said, not as an accusation. "I carry a lot of reason," she said. "The anger is a secondary condition." "How do you keep doing it?" he asked. "Coming into places where nobody is willing to see you and making them see you anyway." She thought about it. "Because the land does not care whether I am seen," she said. "The measurement is accurate regardless of what anyone thinks of me. The truth of a boundary line exists independent of opinions about who is qualified to find it. I find that stabilizing." He was quiet for a moment. "That is the loneliest thing I have ever heard," he said softly. She opened her mouth to deny it and found she could not. "Yes," she said instead, and her voice was very quiet. "It is." He moved slightly closer to her on the narrow porch step, not touching, just near enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold October night. She did not move away. "You do not have to keep doing it that way," he said. "I am a drifter, Wesley," she said. "It is what I do." "It is what you have been," he said. "Those are different things." She looked at the dark street in front of them for a long time. "You are asking me to consider a future that is not my present," she said. "I am suggesting," he said carefully, "that futures can be changed by information, by evidence, by someone willing to look at what is actually there." She looked at him then, and he was looking back at her, and the night was very cold and very still, and neither of them looked away. "I need to sleep before tomorrow night," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another minute. Then she stood, and he caught her hand for a brief moment before she went inside, just the press of his warm hand around her cold fingers, and then let go. She lay awake for an hour afterward, staring at the ceiling and thinking about measurement, about how some distances could not be accurately assessed from the outside, about how the only way to know the true extent of something was to put yourself in the middle of it and take your readings from there. She admitted to herself in the darkness, in the middle of something she had not planned for. The night of the break-in was clear and bitter cold. Harlan Decker's house was the largest in Cutter's Bluff, a 2-story affair on the north side of town, with a long covered porch and the particular smugness of a building that knows it is larger than everything around it. Wesley confirmed that Decker and his 4 regular dinner companions had settled in at the saloon before he and Violet crossed through the back garden and came in through the unlocked kitchen window that Wesley had checked that afternoon on the pretext of delivering a county notice. The study was on the 2nd floor. They moved through the dark house with a single shielded lamp, and Violet went straight to the mahogany desk because, in her experience, a man who was conducting fraud always kept the most important materials close, the working materials, the things that had not yet been filed and were therefore most vulnerable and most incriminating. The locked drawer took her 40 seconds with a tool she carried specifically for this purpose, a slim piece of shaped steel her father had given her before she left home, telling her it had opened more problems than it had caused. Inside the drawer was a map, not the mud-trampled map she had found in the street, which she now suspected had been carried there by accident in someone's saddlebag. This was the master map. It was a clean, precise, large-format survey document of the entire Glenwood Creek Valley and the surrounding territory, annotated in red ink with the planned future boundaries of Decker's holdings as they were intended to be after the next phase of falsification was complete. There were 9 more properties scheduled to be absorbed. The Callaway Ranch was circled in red. 3 other family names she recognized from the land office records were circled in red, and at the bottom of the map, in handwriting different from the survey annotations, was a set of figures that made Violet go very still. "Wesley," she said quietly. He was behind her immediately. He looked over her shoulder at the map, and she heard his breath change. "That is a railroad agreement," he said. Those numbers, that is the price per acre being offered for a land right-of-way. The Santa Fe Railway, Violet said, keeping her voice steady with effort. They are planning an extension through this valley. Decker has already entered into a private agreement to sell them the right-of-way, the land that he has not yet legally stolen. She traced the red lines on the map with her finger, not touching, just indicating. He is selling land he does not own to a railway company, using fraudulent surveys as the title documentation. That is not just land fraud. That is federal fraud. The railway company is an interstate operation. The weight of it settled between them in the dark, quiet room. This changes everything, Wesley said. It changes the jurisdictional authority, she said. Federal fraud brings in federal marshals, not territorial courts. Decker cannot reach federal marshals the way he can reach local officials. How long would it take, Wesley said, to get a federal marshal here? The nearest federal marshal office is in Santa Fe. If I send an urgent telegraph tonight and back it with the documentation I have already prepared, I estimate 10 days to 2 weeks. And in the meantime, she carefully copied the map's key features into her notebook, working quickly and precisely, her handwriting small and clean even by lamplight. In the meantime, I suggest we are very careful about what we do next. She finished her copies, replaced the map exactly as she had found it, closed and relocked the drawer and looked around the room. We should not have been here. Whatever we found here we found by other means. He looked at her steadily. You knew that going in? Yes. The telegraph tonight, he said. I will go with you. You do not need to. Violet. His voice was quiet but very firm. I am going with you. She looked at him for a moment in the lamplight, and something shifted inside her that she had spent many years being very disciplined about not letting shift. She had built that discipline piece by piece over years of being alone in the particular way that intelligent, capable women who refused to be small became alone. All right, she said. Let us go. They sent the telegraph from the operator's office at 11 that night, Wesley using his deputy's authority to warrant an urgent official communication. The message was addressed to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe, referenced the specific federal statutes violated, and included enough of Violet's documented evidence to be taken seriously by anyone who read it carefully. Then they walked back through the cold town, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and then Wesley said, "The next 10 days are going to be difficult." "Yes," she said. "Garrett will have reported to Decker that you are still working. Decker will be looking for a way to make you stop." "I know. I want you to move your lodging," he said, "to my house." She stopped walking. He stopped too. He turned to face her, and in the moonlight his expression was absolutely serious. "I have a spare room. A proper, separate room. I want that stated plainly. I am not suggesting anything that is not appropriate. I am suggesting that you should not be alone in the boarding house while a very powerful and dangerous man is wondering what you know." She looked at him for a long moment. She was cataloging everything, the careful way he had phrased it, the earnestness in his face, the way he was simultaneously being protective and making absolutely certain she understood it was not about control. "All right," she said. "A proper, separate room." "Yes," he said, with a gravity that somehow also contained warmth. "Then yes," she said. "Thank you." She moved her things the following morning. His house was modest and very clean, a single-story building on the quiet end of town with a good fireplace and a porch that faced east. The spare room was small but well-made, with a solid door and a real window, and Compass was settled in the small adjacent stable as if he had always lived there. The next 3 days had a domestic rhythm to them that Violet found deeply, almost alarmingly pleasant. She worked in the mornings on organizing her evidence and drafting the detailed legal summary that would accompany the federal complaint. Wesley went about his duties in town, and when he came home in the evenings he cooked, a fact that surprised her until she learned he had been doing his own cooking for 8 years since his previous housekeeper had retired and he had declined to replace her. He was competent at it, and they ate at the kitchen table and talked, and sometimes the talking lasted until very late. He told her about growing up in the valley, about his parents and the land they had worked, about the way the county had been before Decker, the easier version of it. She told him about New Mexico's survey history, about the old land grants from Spanish and Mexican periods that still caused legal complications, about the cases she had worked where ancient boundaries had survived every American survey attempt because they were written into the land itself. On the fourth evening, he asked her directly, "What happens when this is over?" She was quiet for a moment. "I do not know." "You said you were a drifter," he said. "I am." "Have you been, or are you?" He asked, using her own formulation back at her with the precision of a man who had been paying attention. She looked at the fire for a moment. "I drifted because there was nothing to stop for," she said carefully. "That is not the same as having no desire to stop." "What would make you stop?" he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The fire made the room warm and the night outside was cold, and he was asking a question that was very large and had a specific answer. "Evidence," she said softly. "Accurate measurement, something I could be certain was actually there." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was not hurried. It was the same deliberate stillness he brought to everything, and she turned her hand over under his and held it, and neither of them spoke for a while. It was the most romantic moment of Violet Lockhart's 27 years, which she recognized, and also found somewhat characteristic of her own nature that it had been preceded by a conversation about land grant law. On the seventh day, Harlan Decker made his move. It came through the town judge, a man named Abernathy who Violet had already assessed as someone who had survived in Cutter's Bluff by never positioning himself against Decker's interests. Abernathy issued a restraining order against Violet's survey activities, citing an objection filed by Decker's lawyer on the grounds of unauthorized interference with private property rights. The order was served at Wesley's house in the morning, and Violet read it, folded it carefully, and looked at Wesley. "This is actually useful," she said. He stared at her. "He is trying to legally prevent you from continuing your work." "Yes, and to do that, he had to file this document, which names the specific properties he is concerned about and acknowledges the survey activity I have been conducting. That is an official record of his knowledge of my work, which is relevant to demonstrating that the subsequent obstruction was deliberate." She set the paper down. "I need a lawyer. Do you know any lawyer in this territory who is not already in Decker's pocket?" He thought for a moment. "There is a man in Las Cruces, Samuel Ockhaffer. He is an excellent attorney, comes from a family that moved west from Georgia after the war. He has no connection to Decker, and he has taken civil rights and property cases before. Telegraph him today," she said, "and send a copy of the restraining order and my summary documents with the evening mail coach." Wesley telegraphed Samuel Ockhaffer that afternoon, and while he did, Violet went to the land office one final time, not to review records but to formally file a notarized statement of her professional findings, signed in her legal capacity as a certified surveyor, with the county recorder. The county recorder was a nervous young man who had not been employed long enough to be fully corrupted, and he accepted her filing with visible discomfort, but he accepted it. That was the day Decker invited her to his house. The invitation came through his lawyer, formally worded and politely threatening in the way that formal politeness sometimes is. It said that Mr. Decker wished to discuss her professional concerns in a spirit of cooperative resolution and that he hoped she would attend at her earliest convenience. Wesley said, "Do not go." "I am going," Violet said. "He will have men there." "He will have men everywhere," she said. "That is not a reason to avoid the conversation. I want to see his face when he realizes what I know." "That is vanity," Wesley said, and there was an edge to it. "That is strategy," she said. "If he thinks I am manageable, he will not move against the documentation I have already filed. I need him to believe this is still containable through intimidation. I need those 10 days for the marshal to arrive." He looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. "I am coming with you." "Yes," she said. "You are." And so they had arrived at Harlan Decker's grand study on an October evening, with Violet holding the evidence in her steady hands, while Decker told her she had no idea what she was looking at. The silence after she finished speaking had weight, as silences do when truth has been dropped into the center of a room like a stone into still water. Harlan Decker leaned back in his chair, and she watched him make the calculation. The calculation every powerful man makes when he finds himself unexpectedly exposed, whether the threat can be managed and how. "You are a very clever woman," he said finally. His voice was carefully pleasant. "And I can see you have done a great deal of work. I respect that, but I want you to consider what you are proposing to do with this so-called evidence and what it will cost you." "I have already done my considering," Violet said. "The package containing my complete documented findings was mailed to the Territorial Land Commissioner and the Federal Surveyor General's office 6 days ago. A federal telegraph has been sent to the Marshal's office in Santa Fe, acknowledged and on record. I have filed a notarized professional statement with the county recorder. And an attorney named Samuel Ockhaffer, who I suspect you will find has an excellent reputation in territorial court, has been retained and has already received copies of everything I have submitted." The careful pleasantness left Decker's face. "The restraining order you filed this week," Violet continued, "has been included in the federal filing as evidence of your knowledge and deliberate obstruction. The forged notary seal on the Callaway deed transfer, along with the death record of Edmund Price, has been formally attested by me in my professional capacity and submitted to the recorder of deeds. And the surveyor's transit I have been using for the past 11 days produces records accurate to 1/10 of a foot, which means every false marker position on every one of your altered surveys is now documented in opposition to the fraudulent county filings." She set her final piece of documentation on his desk. "That is a copy of the railroad right-of-way agreement I found, by other means, evidence of your plan to sell federally protected grazing land to the Santa Fe Railway using fraudulent deed documentation. That is a federal offense, Mr. Decker. It carries consequences that your influence in Cutter's Bluff cannot prevent." Decker's 2 hired men were very still near the door. Wesley Carson had moved without any ostentation to a position from which he could watch both of them and the door simultaneously. Decker looked at Violet for a long time. She had expected anger. She had expected threats. What she had not quite expected was the look he gave her after that long moment of silence, which was not angry and was not threatening. It was, she thought, almost respectful, in the bleak way that genuine defeat produces something resembling honesty. "What is it you want?" he said. "I want the Callaway property restored to its correct boundary," she said. "I want the Henderson family's loss documented and compensation filed with the Territorial Commissioner to be adjudicated appropriately. I want all falsified records corrected and refiled under the supervision of an independent court-appointed surveyor. And I want the railroad agreement voided and disclosed to the Santa Fe Railway's legal department so that they understand the fraudulent nature of the title documentation they were provided. And if I refuse, you will be explaining yourself to a federal marshal in approximately 4 days, she said, and to a federal court approximately 30 days after that. You may refuse. That is entirely your right." Decker looked at her. He looked at Wesley. He looked at the document on his desk. "Get out of my house," he said quietly. She picked up her copy of the document. "Good night, Mr. Decker." She walked to the door. Wesley walked beside her, not behind her, not in front of her, beside her, and she was grateful for that specific equality in a way she could not entirely explain. They did not speak until they were a full block from Decker's house, and then Wesley exhaled a long, controlled breath and said, "That is the most impressive thing I have ever seen." "It is straightforward application of documented evidence," she said, but her voice was not quite steady. "Violet," he said. She stopped. She turned to look at him. He was shaking his head slowly, and he was smiling, and the smile was the kind that happens when something genuinely wonderful and unexpected occurs, and she had never had that smile directed at her before. You walked into that room with a map and 11 days of work, and you dismantled a 4-year conspiracy in front of its architect, he said. And then you told him what you wanted and walked out. That is not straightforward. That is extraordinary. She felt warmth rise in her face and was grateful for the dark. I had good support, she said. You had yourself, he said. That has always been enough. She looked at him, and the October night was cold and clear, and the stars were the same ones that had been above them since that first night on the boarding house porch, and she had been accurate in her measurement. She was now certain. The thing she had been taking readings of for 11 days was exactly as real and as large as the instruments suggested. Wesley, she said. Yes, he said, and took a step toward her. I would like to stop drifting, she said. If there is evidence that stopping is a reasonable course of action. I have a great deal of evidence, he said, that it is the most reasonable course of action you have ever considered. He reached up and touched her face, and she leaned into his hand, and the cold was nothing at all. Federal Marshal David Calhoun arrived in Cutter's Bluff 7 days after Violet's telegraph, accompanied by 2 deputies and a letter of instruction from the Federal District Court in Santa Fe. He was a quiet, methodical man who read Violet's documentation with the focused attention of someone who had seen a lot of legal work and knew good work when it was placed in front of him. This is one of the most complete evidentiary packages I have received in 14 years of federal service, he told Violet, in the land office where they met to review the materials. I had the advantage of professional training specific to the fraud method, she said. I have seen professionals present far less, he said. He looked at her over the documents. Are you available to serve as a technical expert witness in the federal proceedings? Yes, she said, without hesitation. Samuel Ockaffer arrived 3 days later, traveling up from Las Cruces by stagecoach, with a leather case full of territorial property law precedents, and the focused energy of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case. He was 41 years old, with a precise and formal manner that softened rapidly when he reviewed Violet's work. And he and Violet spent 2 full days at Wesley's kitchen table going through every document, while Wesley kept them supplied with coffee and the occasional observation that turned out to be legally relevant, because he had been present for the actual survey work. Ockaffer filed the civil complaint on behalf of the Calloway family and the territory's affected landowners within the week. The federal fraud charges against Decker were filed separately and simultaneously. Decker's lawyer made 2 motions to dismiss in the first 48 hours, and both failed because the documentation was too thorough and the federal jurisdiction was too clear. Burl Garrett, when it became apparent that the situation was beyond management, made the practical decision to cooperate with the federal marshal in exchange for reduced charges, and his testimony confirmed the physical process of the survey marker alterations in enough detail to constitute a confession on behalf of the operation as a whole. Harlan Decker was arrested in the 3rd week of November. He was transported to Santa Fe for federal proceedings. His properties, pending the outcome of the litigation, were placed in receivership by court order. The railroad right-of-way agreement was voided by the Santa Fe Railway's legal department, who were extremely unhappy about having been party to fraudulent title documentation and who cooperated fully with the federal investigation. The Calloway family got their eastern parcel back before December. Margaret Calloway came to Wesley's house to tell Violet herself, arriving on a cold, clear morning with a wagon full of her best preserves and a hug that lasted long enough to make Violet's eyes sting in a way she attributed to the cold. You saved this family, Margaret said. I read surveys, Violet said, and Margaret laughed with the easy warmth of a woman whose relief was enormous and genuine. Child, Margaret said, looking at Violet with the calm assessment of a woman who had raised children and knew something about people, you did not have to do any of this. You could have kept writing. You stopped because you wanted to make something right. That is not a skill. That is a kind of heart. Violet held Margaret's hands and could not think of anything adequate to say. Wesley found her on the porch afterward, looking out at the morning. He stood beside her in the way he had come to stand beside her, close enough to feel, separate enough to respect. "She is right, you know," he said. "I know," Violet said quietly. She had stopped arguing about it a week ago. He turned to look at her. "I have something I need to ask you." She turned to look at him. His face had the expression it got when he was saying something important and organizing it carefully to say it right. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not just until the case is resolved. Not as a transient arrangement." He paused. "I would like you to stay because I have spent the last 3 weeks becoming entirely certain that this is where you belong, and entirely certain that that is not a thing I can simply decide. You have to decide it too." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was doing what it did in October, coming in low and golden across the porch, and the valley beyond town was the valley she had measured to the inch, and knew in the particular complete way she knew the things she had spent time with. "I need to know some things first," she said. "Ask me," he said. "Do you understand that I will always have my own work, that I am not going to stop being a surveyor because I am also something else?" "I would not want you to," he said with complete sincerity. "This county needs a good surveyor. Honestly, it should have had one for years. Do you understand that I am not easy to live with? I am exacting and I keep irregular hours and I think about measurements at dinner. I am aware of all of those qualities," he said, "and I find them characteristic rather than inconvenient." She looked at him. "And you know that I have never done this before, any of it." His expression shifted to something softer. "I know. I am going to need accurate measurements," she said. "I need things to be what they actually are, not what they look like." "I know that about you," he said. "It is one of the things He paused and then said the word without flinching. "Love about you." The word landed in the still morning air and stayed there. "Wesley," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said simply, because she was a woman who dealt in accurate measurements, and denying what was clearly documented served no one. He smiled, and this time she did not need the dark to hide her own smile. He kissed her then, or she kissed him, because it happened at the same moment that they both moved, and it was unhurried and warm and entirely right. And the morning light continued to come across the porch at its low October angle, because the world had not paused for the occasion, and that was fine. They were married in the spring, in the courthouse in Cutter's Bluff by Judge Abernathy, who had replaced Decker's influence with a cautious but genuine effort at impartiality since the federal proceedings had made it clear that the old accommodations were no longer available. Samuel Ockhaffer attended. Margaret Calloway and Thomas attended, and Thomas had brought wildflowers from the valley that Margaret had arranged into something beautiful without fuss. Marshal Calhoun sent a letter from Santa Fe that was formal and warmly worded, and which Violet kept in her survey case. The ceremony was brief and sincere, the words exchanged with the directness that both of them brought to everything. Wesley's voice was steady and very warm when he made his vows. Violet's voice was quiet and clear and absolutely certain. The Decker proceedings concluded in August of that year, resulting in a federal conviction on 12 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy. The sentence was substantial. His properties were auctioned under court supervision, with a portion of the proceeds directed toward a compensation fund for the landowners who had been defrauded. The Henderson family, now in Colorado, received a formal notification and a check that brought Margaret Calloway to tears when Violet told her about it. By summer, Violet had been formally contracted by the Territorial Land Commissioner as a permanent consultant surveyor, the first woman to hold such a contract in New Mexico Territory history. The commissioner had initially hesitated, until Samuel Ockhaffer pointed out that her work had just saved the territory a federal scandal and corrected 4 years of fraudulent records, at which point the hesitation resolved itself. She set up a proper survey office in town, a narrow room with good windows and shelf space for documents, and a solid front door with her name on the glass. Violet Carson, licensed land surveyor. The sign was Wesley's idea, and he had commissioned it without asking her, and she had come home to find him looking at it with the satisfaction of a man who had put exactly the right thing in exactly the right place. She had not said anything. She had kissed him instead, which he appeared to receive as adequate acknowledgment. She was pregnant by autumn, a fact she determined with her characteristic methodical approach before telling Wesley on a Sunday morning over coffee. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen before, something enormous and quiet, and then he stood up and came around the table and held her with a gentleness that was somehow also very strong, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Their son was born in June of 1885, delivered by the county physician in the bedroom of the house on the quiet end of town. He had Wesley's dark hair and Violet's winter sage eyes, and Wesley held him in the doorway of the room with the morning light coming through the curtains, looking at him with the expression of a man confronting something that exceeded all previous experience. Violet, exhausted and quietly triumphant, watched from the bed. "He needs a name," Wesley said. "I have been thinking about Edmund," Violet said. "For the notary, the real one." Wesley looked at her across the room, this man who had followed a quiet female drifter around a valley for 11 days and watched her decode a hidden scheme and dismantle it piece by piece, and who had fallen in love with her intelligence before he fully understood what was happening. "Edmund," he said. "Yes." Edmund Carson was an opinionated infant who grew into an opinionated toddler with a clear preference for being outdoors and a talent for finding things that were not supposed to be found, which Violet took as professionally encouraging. By the time he was walking steadily, she was carrying their second child, and she continued her survey work through 7 months of the pregnancy because the territorial commissioner had a contract deadline, and she was not the kind of person who let physical inconvenience override a contract deadline. Wesley said nothing about this, having learned that expressing concern about Violet's professional choices was best done once, clearly, and then accepted when she made her own decision. He expressed his concern once. She made her own decision. He accepted it and spent the time she was in the field making sure the office was warm when she returned. Their daughter was born in the winter of 1887. They named her Margaret, after the woman with wildflowers and a widow's eyes and a kind of courage that did not announce itself, and Margaret Calloway came to the naming and held the baby with her rancher's hands as if she were something extraordinarily precious, which she was. The valley continued. The small ranchers continued. The Calloway Ranch went from debt to stability to modest prosperity under Thomas's management, and the grass on the eastern parcel where the fraudulent marker had stood was indistinguishable from the grass on either side of it, because land does not keep the memory of human dishonesty. It simply is what it is, yielding accurate measurements to whoever is trained to take them. Violet's survey office expanded over the years. She trained 2 assistants, one of whom was a young Navajo man named Henry who had an extraordinary natural talent for spatial measurement, and whom she argued into a formal apprenticeship that led eventually to his own certification. She wrote 2 monographs on land fraud detection methodology that were published in the Territorial Land Commissioner's annual reports, and which were cited in 3 subsequent federal fraud cases in other territories. She and Wesley continued to have supper at the kitchen table and talk until late, about the valley and the cases she was working, and the county business he managed, and the children who were growing with the specific determinism of people who have come from 2 strong sources. Edmund, at 4, had opinions about boundary lines that were technically inaccurate but directionally correct. Margaret, at 2, had her father's stillness and her mother's exactness and spent long periods observing things before touching them. "She is going to be a surveyor," Wesley said one evening, watching Margaret study a beetle with the focused intensity of a scientist. "She might be anything," Violet said, "but she will be thorough at it." He looked at her across the evening light. They had been married 6 years. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her in Decker's study, with the sustained amazement of a man who had understood something important and never quite gotten over the understanding. "You are thinking about the valley," he said. "I am thinking about you," she said. He smiled. "What specifically?" "I am thinking that the measurement was accurate," she said. "From the beginning." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had taken it that first night, deliberately and warmly, and she turned her hand under his the same way she always did. Outside, the New Mexico night was clear and cold and full of stars, the same stars that had been above them since the first evening on the boarding house porch, when a quiet female drifter and a deputy sheriff had stood at the edge of something large, and neither of them had known yet how large. The boundary lines of Cutter's Bluff were accurate now, documented to the inch and filed with 3 separate government offices, and verified by the only surveyor in the territory who had found what everyone else had missed. The hidden scheme was long exposed. The trap had been sprung and the danger had passed, and the secrets were secrets no longer. And what remained, when the fraud was stripped away and the forged documents were corrected, and the false markers were properly placed, was the truth of things as they actually were, which had always been there, waiting for someone with the training and the courage to read it clearly. Violet Carson, licensed surveyor, held her husband's hand in the evening light of their kitchen, listened to her children breathing in the next room, and was, for the first time in her life, exactly where she had taken accurate measurement and determined she should be. It was, she thought, the most reliable reading she had ever taken, and it would hold.